It's fairly obvious that we humans are alive, but so are a lot of other things. So in order to truly understand what's going on, we should understand the characteristics that are necessary for life, because we need to understand what we have in common with everything that's living in order to understand how we're unique. So in this presentation, we're going to look at what characteristics all living things possess. You probably learned this in biology, so it's just a review. In order to get the creative juices flowing and your thinking moving, think about organisms that are living. Think about how diverse the living organisms are. So create a list either by thinking on your own if you're working by yourself or by talking to people at your table of what are some organisms that are living. Try to come up with as diverse a list as possible. Now, before we jump into what the 8 characteristics of life actually are, I want you to think about what you think they are or what you might remember from biology. Remember, these characteristics must apply to everything you just put on that list, everything from as small as bacteria to as big as humans. Think about what's necessary. And again, if this is review, what do you remember from biology? Over the next couple of slides, we're going to look at what the characteristics of life are. You should see in your group folder this graphic organizer. This is a great way for you to take notes about the characteristic of life. It helps you organize the ideas here, and if this is helpful, I strongly encourage you to use it, but if you prefer to take notes in a different way, I absolutely support that as well. The first characteristic of life that we're going to look at is obtain and use nutrients and energy. And this one is a doozy. There are multiple parts to this. Anything that comes in or out of your body is part of this. So the first part, metabolism. And metabolism takes a look at digestion, when you add energy to your body, and movement, where you subtract energy from your body. So when we're talking about metabolism, especially digestion, we're looking at what is the organism eating. When we're talking about movement, how we use energy, that's how are we moving around, how do our muscles work, how much energy are we burning as we do those things. Also part of this characteristic is respiration, the oxygen that we take in and the carbon dioxide that we take out. We also have circulation, things moving around our body, the diffusion that takes place, and some of that diffusion is going to require energy, especially active transport, and also excretion. How do we make waste filtered by the kidneys to create urine? That's typically our nitrogen waste. The second characteristic of life is that living things are made up of cells. All living things are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function, and cells come from pre-existing cells. These 3 bullets here are the cell theory, that all living things are made up of cells. A third characteristic of life is respond to stimuli. So one of the ways that humans respond to stimuli is that we have specialized receptor cells that recognize light, sound, and external stimuli. This is more developed in humans and other higher vertebrates than it is in some of the more simple organisms, but even simple bacteria are able to respond to the environment by moving away from light or other things. The fourth characteristic of life is growth and development, and those are 2 very different words, because grow means like to get bigger in size. So at birth, you were this itty bitty tiny baby, and now you're pretty much in your adult body. So you've gotten significantly bigger over your lifespan. So growth is one piece of it. The other part is development. And at birth, you haven't finished developing. At puberty, you reached your sexual maturity. So the ability to be able to reproduce is part of that development piece. And the 2 typically go together because when there's growth, there's typically also development. And by the time you finish growing, you've reached your sexual maturity and you're capable of reproduction. The 5th characteristic of life is homeostasis, and we will talk more about this later in the unit because homeostasis is going to be a topic we talk about with every single unit that we cover, every body system, because anytime there's an imbalance to that homeostatic mechanism, it typically means that there's something that's going on that's not good. It could be a disease, it could be cancer, it could be any number of things, but homeostasis, when it's not maintained, is a problem. So one of the characteristics of life is homeostasis, and that's an ability to maintain a stable internal environment. And one example of that is body temperature, and that's probably the easiest one to explain. But again, we'll talk more about this soon. So when you go outside and it's a really hot day, if we were to stick a thermometer in you, your body temperature would still be 98.6. In order to maintain that stable internal body temperature of 98.6, your body will actually sweat. By sweating, it's evaporative cooling. And so it cools your body down so your body doesn't reach 105 degrees. It actually stays nice and cool inside because sweating takes that liquid away, and by doing so, it keeps your body temperature lower. Some organisms that can't maintain their body temperature, like a lizard, is just going to seek shade where it's cooler, and that's going to help that organism maintain its body temperature. So it's not necessarily just a body temperature issue. There are other examples of homeostasis, and again, we'll cover this throughout the year, but we'll go a little bit more in depth into this later in this unit. The sixth characteristic of life is reproduction. So most organisms reproduce sexually. By doing so, it increases genetic diversity, and increase in genetic diversity increases the likelihood that the species will survive. There are a lot of organisms that reproduce asexually. By doing so, it increases their numbers rapidly, but it can come at a cost because bacteria, for instance, reproduces asexually, but one antibiotic can typically wipe out a whole population of bacteria. Whereas if there's genetic diversity, some of them could survive. The seventh characteristic of life is having a universal code. For the vast majority of life, DNA is how traits get passed on from one generation to the next. For some organisms, it's RNA, but the vast majority is DNA. There must be some code that we use to get genetic traits from the parents to the children, and that's a characteristic of all living things. The final characteristic kind of plays off of a bunch of the other ones before now. The last characteristic of life is evolution. And this is how traits get passed from one generation to another generation through reproduction. But the traits that are most likely favored by the environment are the ones that survive. Those that survive can then reproduce and perpetuate the species. So these are the 8 characteristics of life. At this point, if there's any part of your graphic organizer that you have not completed, go back and finish that now. If you have any questions, just ask Ms. Saxon and she'll help you out.